Okay, and we are live. And good evening, everybody. This is Patrick Milliken from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and I am here. We're starting another one of our virtual events. And tonight we're going to be featuring this terrific new Sherlock Holmes anthology called In League with Sherlock Holmes. And we have the great Laurie King and Leslie Klinger here to discuss the book. And due to the miracles of technology, they are, I think, Leslie, you're in Los Angeles, Laurie, you're in Northern California, and Barbara is in Paris somewhere from the looks of the background. Is that right?
Now it's my Georgian townhouse background. So imagine that I'm actually right next door to 221 B Baker Street.
There you go.
That is a really pretty background, actually.
It's very nice. It's courtesy of the Phoenix Art Museum, as a matter of fact. It's one of their miniature rooms. But I think Les and I have talked in front of it before. Didn't we do that, Les?
I think so. I think so.
Right. But it just looked like it was the right thing for Sherlock Holmes. So we do have autographed copies of In the League of sorry, I botched
In League
the
with
title.
Sherlock Holmes. Yep.
In League with.
In League with Sherlock Holmes, which Laurie has thoughtfully signed, and Les has done a book plate.
Yep.
And
so
in my opinion, it's an absolutely ideal Christmas gift for any reader.
Absolutely.
Short fiction, beautifully done, autographed by the authors, range of topics, range of stories, all fun.
Very interesting group of contributors too, really running the gamut of the genre. That's very cool.
We should correct what Patrick said. This is not a Sherlock Holmes anthology.
Right.
It is an anthology of stories inspired by Sherlock.
Inspired by Sherlock Holmes.
And those expecting
a lawyer in the room here.
Well, those expecting all stories starring Sherlock Holmes will be disappointed.
Right. So it's not part of the canon, as it were.
They're not pastiches.
Inspired by the canon. Yeah.
Well, but one of the really interesting things about Sherlock Holmes is then he metamorphoses into all sorts of times and adventures and people who represent him. So what is this, your fifth? I'm trying to remember. Is this the fourth or the fifth?
Yeah. There's a little row of them behind.
Right. So you've had any number of authors contribute in each in their own way to the canon. I'm sorry, Patrick, I cut you off. What was it you wanted to say?
Oh, I was just going to say to everybody watching on Facebook, if you have questions for Les or Laurie, go ahead and send them in, and I'll be monitoring the questions on Facebook as they come in, and I will kind of disappear from view here, but maybe Barbara, 35, 40 minutes in, we can jump to questions if there are some. Sound good?
It sounds wonderful.
Great.
So let me remove myself from the equation.
This is magical. I just love the way this all works. It's almost like smoke and mirrors. I think Holmes would actually have loved it if it had only been available to him. So let me just briefly introduce our authors, not that either one of them needs it, but Laurie R. King is the multi-decorated Edgar-winning author of the Kate Martinelli series, the Mary Russell, and recently added Mary Holmes series, because I remember when it was just the Mary Russell series, Larry, but now Holmes has kind of snuck in there, and numerous short fiction and standalone novels. Leslie S. Klinger, a distinguished attorney, is an also Edgar and other award-winning. He's an anthologist, he is an annotator, he is an editor, he's an all-around brilliant guy, and currently fielding how many different things? Let's see, the Library of Congress Crime Classics, the Haunted Library, which is wonderful.
Right, which is the Horror Writers Association.
Sherlock Holmes works with Laurie. And then you are constantly annotating books on your own for other publishers, and in a wide range, all the way from Frankenstein to, but you really made a splash with your two Sherlock Holmes volumes, annotated the novels and then the stories. How many years ago was that, Les?
The first two volumes came out in 2004, so that's about 2 lifetimes ago now. The third volume came out in 2005. I mean, just the math. I mean, it's like, first of all, to think that it was 15, 16 years ago. I mean, I started that project with the Sherlock Holmes reference library, which began to appear in 1998. And, you know, given recent events, this really, it seems like a lifetime ago. So they're old now. I mean, they're so old that I've actually been talking to the publisher about, is it time to start thinking about the new and expanded annotated Sherlock Holmes, to do the 20th year anniversary edition or something? And so we're going to have some talks about that.
Honestly, Les, you know, you really are an addict. I wonder if there's some sort of meeting or friends of available for addicted annotators, because it's like
Friends of the
some
Footnote.
promotion for you.
Oh, I love
Footnote
that.
Anonymous.
I love that idea. Friends of the Footnote. Yes.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it is addicting. It's hard not to read anything and want to sort of put footnotes on it. Laurie has suffered through this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So Laurie, which one of you actually conceived this project, in which Poison Pen Press and I were peripherally involved for the first volume, but which
Yeah.
one of you dreamed up this collaboration?
Well, it was, you know, one of those conversations that you have in a bar.
Yeah.
And you kind of wonder what's going to happen to the publishing world in about 2 years' time, when nobody has had any conversations in bars for the entire of 2020. And the whole publishing world in 2 years is going to be saying, wait, doesn't anyone have a book coming out this year?
Or at least a creative idea. You're right.
I think it was at Left Coast down in, is it San Diego or Long Beach?
Long Beach, I think.
Long Beach,
Yeah.
Long Beach. And Les bullied his way into running a Sherlock Holmes panel with all the guests of honor, Lee Child and Mike Connolly and
Jan Burke.
And they said, no, you can't do that because they're the guests of honor. And he said, well, yeah, but they love Sherlock Holmes. And being Les, he just sort of assumed it was it was happening. And who could argue with that face? And afterwards, you know, in the bar, Les and I were sitting there saying, "Hey, that was really fun. That was really fun." And one or the other of us said, "You know, we should do a book." And that was the first one, and then the second one, and third one, and fourth one, and then this fifth one, which I don't have an author copy of. So.
And in fact, Jan and Lee were both contributors to the first volume. Michael was too busy writing his 2 novels a year and had made us wait till the second one before he contributed. But
if anyone is interested in looking at what the titles are and where to get them, I have a page on my website, the laurierking.com website. That is, I think it's etc. And there's all kinds of odds and ends books on there, including the 5 of these books. And you can find the order information from Poison Pen.
Yes, Barbara published, you may recall, it was a long time ago now. It's like 2011, a hardcover of the first volume, A Study in Sherlock. And since after that, we switched over, the rest have been published by Pegasus. It was Random House that published paperback, and Poison Pen published the hardcover.
We did. There were bookstore politics swirling all around that
Oh,
particular
yes.
publication, adding to the drama for those of us in the know.
It's always
there. Right. So
and Dana is in this one. So Dana's got a story in this one, and Alan Bradley and Lee and Colin Cotterall did our graphic in that one, and so it was, you know, a lot of fun.
And they embraced a lot of forms. Colin did a graphic novel, if I remember, and somebody, I don't remember if it was Dana, somebody did it with what, email? Wasn't there a story that involved an email structure?
In the second volume, I think Michael's Andrew Grant. I think in either the second or the third volume, Andrew Grant did one that was emails and social media and all that.
There's this.
Oh, yes. Well, there's that. There was that wonderfulness. Laurie and yes, amazingly, Laurie was able to hook me up with Mary Russell, so to speak, with Mary Russell. And we did, I called it a twinterview. And she kindly answered some questions right up until she had enough and cut me off. But we
She doesn't
printed.
suffer fools gladly. And at a certain
No.
point, she decided that Les Klinger qualified a little bit as a fool. And she said, I'm awfully busy. Goodbye.
But so we published the text of the interview. Maybe that's what you're remembering. The text, the exchange of tweets
On
is
Twitter. Yeah.
Right.
is
Well,
in
I
the book.
remember that there were some, unconventional formats along with unconventional stories.
Yeah.
So my next question would be for Les to answer. What was the pitch that you gave to authors? Did they rush and just throng you when you announced you were doing it?
Well, yes, they did. I mean, we basically said to them, I mean, we said, we know you love the Sherlock Holmes stories. We're not asking you to write a Sherlock Holmes story. I mean, we were very clear about that from day one. We said, we're asking you to write something that sort of launches from the Sherlock Holmes stories, is inspired by. Some people wrote actual Sherlock Holmes stories.
Yeah.
Other people wrote marvelous stories that sort of riffed on them, took off of them. Laura Lippman, for example, wrote a story for that first collection about a little girl named Shirley Holmes. It's a very serious story about her learning that not all secrets are meant to be discovered and revealed. And it's a very touching story. It's clearly not a Sherlock Holmes story. Neil Gaiman wrote a story, as only Neil could, about an old Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes in his 70s or 80s or 90s, struggling with old age and dealing with the issues that come with that. Lionel Chatwin, major Hollywood player, screenwriter, wanted to write a story about Sergeant Major of the Army and his sidekick, who clearly are Holmes and Watson, but Holmes and Watson are never mentioned in the story, and so on. So it was a lovely collection of pieces. Some were pure pastiche. S.J. Roseanne wrote a brilliant story for that collection called The Men with the Twisted Lips, which was a retelling of the Sherlock Holmes story, The Man with the Twisted Lip, from a different point of view, totally faithful to the original story, and yet shocking, revelations that you had no idea were sort of buried in that story. So people had fun, and we been turned down once or twice by authors? Yeah, once or twice. Mainly people who don't feel like they're comfortable. Or sort of, they love Holmes, but they're not sufficiently knowledgeable. That's been the excuse we've gotten from a couple people to write a suitable story. But no, I mean, when you look at, we're now up to 75 contributors for these 5 volumes, more than 75 actually, because a couple of them have been teams, and they're all over the place. There are maybe 20% are stories about Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, but that's all. And the other 80% are just wonderful inspirations.
So
That's
the one
terrific.
that was such fun with the first collection, the study of Sherlock, is typical because we start with a kind of core group. Les and I, toss names out, and we say, "Oh yeah," and "Can you get them?" and "Oh, I think so." And so we end up with a core of half a dozen or 8, and we then look at who they are, what kind of writing they tend to do. Although a lot of the stories are not exactly the kind of writing that they normally do, because this is a chance to have fun. So, but the kind of flavor that we see coming out of the 6 or 8 authors, we then try and fill in a little, so that if we have, mostly horror writers, we'll go for a few mysteries. If we have mostly men, we'll say we need some women's voices. Not that we're looking for a balance, but we're looking for an interesting mix. So I had tossed forward the idea of Colin Cotterill, because he's one of the funniest writers out there, and yet like some comedic writers, also very full of heart and thought. and you know, the stories that he writes can be very moving as well as ridiculously silly. And so Colin said, yes, sure, I'd love to. He lives in Thailand. And so I happened to be looking at his website, and I saw all these very odd cartoons that he drew. And I thought, so I checked, I checked first with Random House and said, can you do, you know, a drawing on the page? And they said, sure, no problem. So I wrote to Colin and I said, would you like to do your story illustrated? So he turned around and said, would you like a graphic story? And I said, so we had to get the, you know, permission from Random House to make sure that they could do it, because this has to go in ebooks and the rest of it. So, and they said, sure, we can work around that. So he did the most fabulous comedic story about how he was asked to write a Sherlock Holmes story by Larry King, and thinking that so and that's so typical, because these stories come in and they drop into our inbox, and you open them like it's Christmas, because you think, what am I going to find here? And you find these little gems and you think, oh, I have the best job in the world.
Well, naming no names, Laurie, have you ever had to turn one down?
Well, because these are all requested, you know, there have been some that were not workable in the form that we are given them. Because for one thing, these have to be short stories. And we had a couple that really were novellas, which I sympathize with, because I tend to write really long short stories myself. I mean, a short story for me is 20 pages, and for most people it's 10. So if you, oh, I mean, I'm sorry, I meant 20,000 words, whereas for most people it's 10,000. So if you have something that is only large because it needs editing down, then you can work with it. If it's that large because it needs to be that full a story, it doesn't really go in a book of short stories. And we've had one or two that we had to really severely cut. It was painful, but they worked. So
yeah, but we've never turned down a story, Barbara, because I mean, first of all, we're not soliciting the stories. We're soliciting the writers. I mean, these are all A-list writers. We made the decision early on that nobody was going to get paid by the word. Nobody was going to get paid more because they were a bigger name than somebody else. So everybody gets paid the same. And
which isn't a lot.
Yeah, which is to say nothing. And we have said to them, look, there are no rules about what you can write about here, other than obviously it needs to have some connection to Sherlock Holmes. It's somebody like Sherlock Holmes. It's somebody who is a fan of Sherlock Holmes. It's one of the characters from the Sherlock Holmes stories, etc. But that's it. And so, like Laurie says, it's like Christmas. We get these things and they're wonderful. Now, we did solicit some special pieces over the years. We liked the graphic story that Colin did so well that in subsequent years, we actually went and asked people to write graphic stories. And we've gone to people who we knew had that kind of background. So John Reppian and his wife Leah Moore wrote a lovely piece for us one year. Tony Lee and his artist partner did one. William Kotzwinkle and his artist partner did one year. And this year we have Joe Hill. And, you know, and that came out of, I solicited Joe when you and Joe and I did an event together at the store. And I knew that he was doing graphic stuff at that point. He had started a whole new line of comic books. And so I very specifically asked him if he would do a graphic story, and he loved it. So we have one of his graphic stories in the book about his character, Sherlock Holmes, a stand-up comic who is a detective. So we've gone after that. Last volume, we asked Gay and Wilson to contribute something, and he decided he was going to do some original cartoons for us. So we have never put the contributors in a box. These are A-list writers. These are fabulous talents, and we delight in seeing what they come up with.
What a shame that even Gory had died before you really got this whole thing going, because I'm sure part of it's his association with Masterpiece Theater and all, but it's kind of hard to think of illustrated crime without thinking of Gory. So anyway, Laurie, tell us a little bit about who is in this volume. I mean, there are a whole bunch of authors, so rattle them off or do a couple, and then Les could do a couple. Tell us what's going on.
Well, it's, there's a couple of different things as we're going along and building these books. As I said, we start out with a few people that we've sort of thought of, or they had promised us a story before and couldn't quite get it into time or wanted to think about it. And so we'll go back to them and say, so we're putting another one together, because these are every couple of years. Do you want to be in this one? And they normally say yes. So there were a few of those, and I then bounced a few names off Les that I thought would be a huge amount of fun. And so we had the Quay Quarty said yes, who wrote The Strange Juju Affair at the Gacy Mansion, set in Ghana, which, where do you see Sherlock Holmes in Ghana except in these kinds of books? We then have to try and put together an interesting order of reading, because most people open it at the beginning and read through. I mean, you don't have to with a short story collection, but you sort of start at the beginning. And so we put Quay first just because it was very different. And then because we wanted something extremely different from that, we put Tess Gerritsen, who has a story called What My Father Never Told Me. And it was, and then it seemed to go time for a kind of horror ghost story creep fest. And Joe and Casey Lansdale did the Case of the Wailing Ghosts for us. And so we put that one next. And then we gave Robin Bursell the fourth point. She had a very
you left out Jim Ziskin.
Psychological thing. Sorry?
You left out Jim Ziskin. You skipped over Jim.
So I have not.
He was the fifth one. He's the fourth one. Robin was the fifth one.
I'm not working on the books. I'm just working on loose pages, and he fell out of place. So
okay, yeah.
Jim, I'm sorry, Jim, you fell out of place.
And Jim's, by the way, is a real Sherlock Holmes pastiche. Yeah. I mean, it's a really terrific tale about Holmes.
One of our and then we have as I said, Robin Bursell's, and then we have the graphic one. After which, what else would you do except have a very academic one of Martin Edwards? The observance of trifles.
Well, Martin's actually, in some ways, patterning his new series with Rachel Sabernig out, after Holmes. He got very interested in it. So Mortmain Hall and its sequel.
Well, he's been a big Sherlock Holmes fan for a long time, and he actually has written some pastiches before. Right. This is not that. This is a little different, and it's really well done. But it's about a super Sherlock Holmes fan, and it's a terrific story.
Yeah. Yeah. And do you want to do the rest of them, Les?
Sure. So again, as Laurie said, what we try to do is partly anthologies require some, quote, big names, because that's why people buy the books. So, yes, we can include a Joe Hill or a Joe Lansdale or a Tess Gerritsen, but we also want some of our friends who are star writers, but they're not sort of the A+ New York Times #1 bestseller list. So we included people like Naomi Hirahara, a dear friend of mine for many years, who is an extremely talented writer, Edgar winner, etc. She wrote a terrific story about a student, an undergraduate, who seems to be sort of like, he could turn out to be Sherlock Holmes. Lisa Morton, my writing partner on some other books, in the horror field and the former president of the Horror Writers Association, but also a mystery writer. Wrote a terrific story for us about Conan Doyle and a mystery involving a seance, a subject that Lisa has just put out a nonfiction book on. So Derek Haas, a friend, a client, major screenwriter, and I think 4 or 5-time novelist, a mystery novelist, thrillers really, wrote a surprising story about Holmes's background. Let's say his family. I don't want to give away too much on that. David Corbett, a longtime friend of Laurie's and mine, Bay Area writer, terrific writer, wrote a story, again, in many ways a true Sherlockian pastiche, but with some very unusual elements. Brad Parks, good friend of both of ours, great thriller writer, wrote a wonderful story about a Jersey girl who loves Holmes and finds that she has a lot of the same detecting bones when a case comes up. A great story called A Scandal on the Jersey Shore. It was a terrific story. Jim Warren, a master of the short story, wrote a very intricate story involving mathematics and psychology and way above our pay grade to judge, but it's a great story about, again, a person who there's no mention of Sherlock Holmes. It just, this woman must be Sherlock Holmes' descendant or clone or whatever. Maria Alexander, a dear friend of mine, a wonderful award-winning fantasy writer who I knew loved Sherlock Holmes, wrote a great story about Benedict Cumberbatch and a little bit of a mystery there. And finally, an old friend of mine, and I think of yours too, Laurie, Quinn Yarborough, who is, of course, a grand master of the horror genre and written dozens of books about vampires and the like, but who I knew also had done, in her slightly younger days, several books under the name Quinn Fawcett that are Sherlockian pastiche. And so she wrote a story for us that's not a Sherlockian pastiche, but is very much about Holmes and the characters from the Holmes stories and their influence down the generations. So it's a very eclectic group. We've always tried to reach beyond the mystery genre in assembling the writers. And so once again, almost a third of the writers here are not what you would think of as mystery writers.
So Laurie, let's keep saying great or terrific story. What makes a great or terrific short story? I'm going to get Les to tell us what a pastiche is.
Okay.
Because not everyone knows what that is. We're
Okay.
a little much into the whole, Holmes vocabulary. But what do what makes a great short story?
It's really tough. I find it very difficult to write a good short story because my natural pace is that of a novel. I find that the short story has to be very precise, very tight. Every scene has to do 2 or 3 things, but it has to feel light. And I have been the the editor on these. Les tends to be the Sherlockian on them and add things and correct things and the rest of it. But I have the tough job of taking, as he says, these A-list writers and saying, can we just change this?
I don't have the courage to do that.
Yeah,
I leave that to Laurie.
Yeah, no, I get the fun part now. Because the parts of a short story all have to mesh perfectly. Because you read it at a sitting, or you're listening to it, in a short period of time, and it has to leave you with an impression of this particular universe, beginning to end. Whether the final flavor in your mouth is whimsy, and you walk away smiling, or whether it's kind of leaves you creepy. But you as the editor for these stories, my job was to see what they wanted to do and to make it a little more so.
Okay,
Which,
doesn't the plot have to have a specific focus? You don't have subplots diving off the main plot because you don't have the space
Right.
for it.
Yeah.
So you really have to have one good idea for the structure and then towards it, right? Without
and it's the
peeling
reason
off.
that that short stories translate well into movies, because you know a 2-hour story on a screen, you don't have time for you know a mini series or a full series of subplots and ongoing characters and the rest of it. You have to have everything very tight, even if they are characters that you know from elsewhere. That particular world has to be in this one, and you don't have the luxury of subplots and commenting
Backstory.
on things that are going on, and yeah, as Les says, backstory. So yeah, as an editor, my job was mostly to cut away and to say, do you really need this? Or is there a way that we can bring this back to the main point more quickly?
Sure. Sort of like Too Many Notes, Mr. Mozart, but
Yeah.
in a different way. So Les, for those who are not that familiar with the Sherlock Holmes canon and vocabulary, what is a pastiche?
Well, pastiche, it's a French word that means something about cakes or something. In truth, but in the literary world, it means something written intentionally in the style of another writer. So for 100+ years, there have been Sherlockian pastiches. Basically, writers who have said there aren't enough Sherlock Holmes stories, I'm going to write another one. And I'm going to try and make it sound like it's from the same voice, the same pen, and so on. And it's hard. It's hard to do it well. There are a handful of writers. Laurie has done it in a slightly different way. Her books are clearly not pastiche because they're not Sherlock Holmes centric. But Bonnie McBird, Lindsay Fay, a handful of other writers who have deliberately tried to add Sherlock Holmes stories to the mass of the 60 stories that Conan Doyle had a hand in. And, you know, they basically, good ones to me. I don't generally like pastiche because most pastiche fails in sounding like it's from the same writer. But this is a long tradition. I mean, obviously, our friend Ace Atkins has been writing Robert Parker books now, and Andrew
Grant.
right, I've forgotten his name. Nygaard. I'm not going to get his name right. Has been writing the V.C. Andrews books, and so on, and they've done so very successfully. But this is a difficult thing. And the other part of short stories is, I mean, Conan Doyle himself complained it was really hard to come up with the ideas. Short stories have to be very tightly focused on a very specific idea. And whatever the MacGuffin is, whatever the gimmick is, whatever the plot twist is. And it's hard. These are all basically, with the exception one or two of our contributors, Jim Warren is a good example. Jim writes almost exclusively short stories, as far as I know. I don't think he's ever written a novel, but all of the others are basically novelists. And so it's a real challenge to write a short story. And frankly, that's one of the reasons that they've said yes in many cases, because they know it's hard work, but they like it. It's a different discipline.
Now I can see that, but you know, there's a whole thing of fan fiction that goes on. And you know, pastiche is one thing, fan fiction is another thing. And then, although it also starts with P, you have to think, you know, is it plagiarizing? I mean, there are all kinds of interesting questions, I think, about, you know, carrying on in someone else's universe. I mean, you know, we were Clive Cussler's bookstore up until he died, and still continue with the books, and we call it the Cussler verse. And, you know, it's a universe created by Clive in which Robert Bursell, who's written one of your stories in this volume, has operated. And, you know, there's the Parker universe that has Ace writing in it, and now Mike Upika, but has had other people. And those are authorized or with the cooperation of the author, same thing. But then, being the Outlander bookstore, I can tell you that fan fiction, people trying to imitate or take the Outlander universe and create something unauthorized and something, you know, of their own, that goes on. And so, you know, pastiche always seemed to me to occupy kind of an interesting role in all of this.
Somebody posed an interesting definition the other day, the difference between fan fiction and pastiche, which was that fan fiction is generally not aimed at a commercial market. It's the writers don't expect to sell it. And that's really the only difference, is that pastiche is done for like any other kind of writing. Now, Nicholas Meyer, our mutual friend Nicholas Meyer, has of course made a great success at writing pastiche. The 7% Solution, the West End Horror, what's the next one called?
Canary Train.
It's the one about the opera. Oh, the Canary Train, the notorious Canary Trainer, and his latest one, The Adventure of the Protocols. I've forgotten the name. There's another, the Purloined Protocols.
Right.
Now, these are all, quote, pastiche, but they're also very serious novels, and written with a great deal of affection for the Sherlock Holmes canon, with a lot of attention to detail, meaning, for example, that Nicholas sends them to me and says, read them and tell me what I did wrong.
Make them better, Les. Yeah.
No, I can't make them better. I just make them more sort of technically accurate.
Yeah. Normally a pastiche is set, I mean, it has all the trappings of the original. I mean, normally a pastiche is set in the Baker Street days, you know, whatever you're pasticheizing, it is set in there so that what you do is you take the characters out from the sequence that they had been given, you give them an adventure, and then you dust them off and you put them back. The problem with that is that sometimes it's hard to put them back because, you know, you can't kill them off. You can't.
Well, that's
you can't
true.
injure them too much.
Well, you did write a pastiche, Laurie.
Sorry?
You wrote a pastiche for the Kate Martinelli book.
Yeah. That was a Sherlock Holmes story.
That
is just a Sherlock Holmes story. So, and it counts as a kind of pastiche. I mean, it's after his dates, but yeah. Yeah.
Well, I noticed the number of, you know, Sherlock Holmes pastiche take place in that interval between when he went over the Reichenbach Falls and when Conan Doyle rethought, you know, all that and brought him back. So there's a period in the chronology of Holmes's life in which nobody really knows for sure where he was or what he was doing.
It's a lovely blank slate. So so writers want to fill it in.
Right. I think, you know, writers can be thankful that Holmes sort of turned on, I mean, that Doyle turned on Holmes there for a while and gave them that.
And there's other sort of connections like that. Probably many people have called a book called The Giant Red of Sumatra by Richard Boyer the finest novel length pastiche. For many years, it's been highly regarded. And basically, this is a small spoiler, it's a continuation of The Hound of the Baskervilles. And it takes the characters from there and sort of spins out more of the story, because at the end of The Hound of the Baskervilles, it's left ambiguous as to whether the villain has truly perished.
Right.
And so, you know, those are the kinds of sort of meticulously placed pastiches. The bad ones, and there's plenty of bad ones, are ones where people write about Sherlock Holmes and they put them in, you know, I hate to mention specifics, but there's one, for example, called Sherlock Holmes and Frankenstein or something like that. It's like, did you miss the part about Frankenstein being in the beginning of the 19th century? You know, 70 years before Holmes was born? But, you know, sometimes that doesn't bother writers. They just go ahead with it.
I mean, after all, Mary Russell is still alive and writing. I mean, she's on Twitter, so these fictional
true.
characters live a long time.
That's true. That's true.
She found a fountain of youth there somewhere. Patrick, are you wanting to come back now, or can you come back and let us know if we have any questions?
Yeah, I can come back.
And by the way, I mean, I should admit, I am guilty of writing a pastiche. Much as I said I didn't like them, I have exactly 2 published pieces of fiction, one in one of the anthologies that Laurie was kind enough to say I wrote a story good enough for, which is not a Sherlock Holmes story, and one that was published many years ago by our friend Otto Penzler, called The Adventure of the Wooden Box, which is a very pure, traditional Sherlock Holmes pastiche. So I'm guilty.
I'm amazed you had time.
But Les and I have, yeah, Les and I have decided that we're going to write one for the next volume, that I'll write the story and he'll annotate it.
I think that's a great idea. I mean, if you have an annotation addict, you might as well take advantage of it. Patrick, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
but we can't see you.
Do you want to see me? Okay.
Sure.
Why not?
Otherwise,
I
it's very strange. Like,
I
there you are.
like hiding. Okay. Actually, I have a question for you both, which is one I'm sure you've heard a lot, but I'm sure you both thought about this quite a bit. Can you articulate what the enduring appeal is of of Sherlock Holmes, this particular character? Could he have existed and flourished the way he has in a different era? Is the era very important? And I think, Barbara, weren't we talking to Thomas Perry, and we had an interesting little side discussion about, would Holmes be successful on the page without Watson essentially translating him for the reader?
Well,
By the way, Tom was one of our contributors. Tom wrote a story for our very first volume.
Right. That same question applies to Nero Wolfe and Archie Goodwin and other people where you have a genius detective, where you almost need, somebody slightly less of a genius in order to keep the reader from feeling completely inferior, or in order to let the reader see how the mind of the genius worked, right? But anyway, it's an interesting question. How would you address it, guys? Laurie?
I think that what Les was saying earlier, and about the great hiatus, you've got these 3 year gap in the story. I think that works on a micro level as well, because the Conan Doyle stories are very clear on what they do, but there's an awful lot that they don't do. You know absolutely nothing about this man's background. You don't know anything about his family, except that he has an even more obnoxious older brother. You know very little about his emotional life. And that is a temptation for any writer to get in there and start digging away. And I think that one of the pleasures of a lot of the pastiches is that they don't limit themselves to the Conan Doyle attitude of all that stuff doesn't matter. Because as readers, we know that it does matter. So that I think the more successful pastiches are ones that accept the general outline of Conan Doyle and the way he tells a story, but they allow the characters to develop in ways that Conan Doyle just wasn't interested in.
Yeah, but I think Patrick's question was, if you started from scratch with a Conan Doyle, he's Edwardian, could you today create a character like that in this very technological age and so forth and have it work?
So my answer to that is, of course you can. Look at the BBC Sherlock. Here's a guy who, they took the character, they moved him to the 21st century, and he is all about social media and computers and that kind of stuff. And it works perfectly. Holmes would have adapted to any era and done it. Now, mean, to me, the deeper question Patrick asked was, why do we want to read Sherlock Holmes? You know, what is the appeal? And there are two separate elements that I think are part of the answer to that. Element number one is this: I call Holmes the attainable superhero. He wasn't bitten by a spider. You know, he wasn't born on an alien planet. He did it the old-fashioned way. You know, he just worked really hard to get smart. Now, maybe he was born with good genetics, you know, good genes that made him super smart. But I think the reader, in part, likes to say to themselves, I could do that. If I just worked hard enough, if I just studied enough, I could be like that. I could be Sherlock Holmes. But the other part of it, which is a critical part of the Doyle stories and the successful pastiches, is the friendship. These are two wonderful friends. They have each other's back. They know each other intimately. They support each other. They treasure each other. Maybe Holmes isn't quite as demonstrative about it as he should be, but we read these stories because of the friendship and because of the warmth of sharing the company of these two men. And that's what many of the pastiches miss. It's not about the adventures. It's not about the celebrities they meet and all that. It's about the relationship between Holmes and Watson, and their characters, and how those characters are revealed as the kind of people that we would want to know. We would want to be the people we would like to be part of that circle of friendship.
But I think that one of the appeals of the stories at the time and on into the modern era is the fact that, yes, in the Victorian time, Holmes represented the idea that we can make change, that we can, by just figuring things out, by having the right kind of wedge that we fit under the insoluble problems, that we can affect change. And I think that appealed hugely to the Victorians, because that was a way of finding sense and structure. And I think that we in the 21st century are still looking at that science can actually figure stuff out.
And that we're not necessarily
2020 has come up with.
And that we're not bound by the rules. I mean, Holmes is clearly not somebody who follows the rules.
No.
He doesn't turn in the criminal to the police when he doesn't think that's appropriate. He doesn't respect authority. He doesn't respect nobility. You know, he's a bohemian. He's outside the rules. And we'd all like to think that that's who we really are. We're not people who would be conformists. We would do the right thing. That's Holmes's motto: do the right thing. And we all would like to believe that that's who we are.
Great answer. Let's see. There are some questions from the Facebook audience. Not as many as I'd like, but question for Laurie from Marjorie. She asks, is there any update on bringing Mary Russell to the small screen, or the big screen for that matter?
Hi, Marjorie. Yeah, you know, this is an ongoing project that you sort of think, yeah, I'm not waiting around on these things. We have there is a production company. It is British. They are moving ahead. They have scripts they are putting together, and they are almost on the edge of pitching it to various places like Netflix and the rest of it. It is structured to be a series of series. I think they had like three-year mini series in the British tradition. Looking at, I believe that they are looking at the first couple of books for it, possibly including O Jerusalem, but I don't know that they've gone that far. So it hasn't gone any further than that. They're not talking actors. They're talking actors, but they haven't asked anyone yet that I know of. They are inviting me to be active, which is fun. I told them the last time we had a conversation that they really needed to hire Les as their advisor to let them know what they couldn't do with the character of Holmes, because if you don't know Holmes, you don't know what is talked about and what isn't. And so I think that Les needs to be on there saying, yeah, no.
The gravy train. I need to be part of the gravy train. Absolutely. Laurie's getting wealthy from this, so why shouldn't I too?
Oh, yes, right. We all know how wealthy the writers are.
Right.
Uh-huh.
Can you tell us anything, Laurie, about your upcoming Mary
Please
Russell
do, Laurie.
novel?
Oh, yes. In fact, Barbara was there when it started. Those
started really.
Those conversations in bars. Well, this one was in a bus, I think. We had gone, Barbara and Robin and their daughter and her husband, and I took a river cruise. I'd never been on a river cruise, and I said, okay. So off we went on the river cruise, and it had a trip out of Bucharest beforehand up into the mountains, i.e. Transylvania. And so we went to this place that Les has been to as well, because it's later on was developed as a Dracula castle, although that's complete nonsense. But it's okay. It's anyway, it's this castle up in the edges of Transylvania. And I absolutely fell in love with everything about it. And so I thought, I got to write a book and set it here. So Russell and Holmes go off to Transylvania. And of course, there's vampires. So that's what the book is about.
Who can actually
resist
Marie, the Queen of Romania? I mean,
and it's Marie, the Queen of Romania, and it's called Castle Shade, and it'll be out in June. And I will certainly do events either virtual or in person for Poison Pen.
Absolutely.
What takes them to Transylvania?
The Queen of Romania has a task for them. Right, Marie, the Queen of Romania, who is a person where the castle has a lot to do with Marie.
So this is a souvenir from the from Castle Brand. This is I got this at Castle Brand because the sort of the parking lot there is filled with vendors selling Dracula memorabilia. This is a statuette of Vlad Tepes, the one-time ruler of the region, and this to me was like I was on the lookout when I was there for sort of the cheesiest souvenir I could find.
I think that counts.
Yeah.
Well done, Les. Very good. Very good. Right.
Kind of looks like Doug Henning as a vampire or something.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
The whole vampire thing didn't start around Bran until I think the 60s, because Ceausescu wanted they had no money in Romania, and they looked around and thought, what can we sell? And they said, well, maybe we could just kind of pretend it does say Transylvania in the front of Dracula. So what about this castle? It's still standing. Yeah. We could use that.
Exactly.
So the whole industry came in from then. So.
And sadly, the communists built a sort of industrial complex on your way up into the Carpathians in one of those beautiful valleys, which is now a complete ruin, but they can't apparently afford to tear it down. So it was all part of, the communism's social engineering, and it's taken a lot of the magic away from that part of the country when you run across this, long factory. I hope at some point they'll be able to dispose of it and bring some of the,
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting when you're writing a historical novel, because you know what happens. I mean, the novel is set, my June novel is set in 1925, and it's way before any of the trouble begins. I mean, they have a fairly successful royalty. It's only the second king that's in there, but it's doing okay. And
an interesting royalty, because they invited them to come be their royalty.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They couldn't give it to anyone who was born in Romania, because there were so many factions. It would have just ruined the country. And in fact, they had laws that you could not marry a Romanian as your consort, which is why there were only two kings, because the third one wanted to marry so, one of the Romanians and refused to, anyway. So I mean, historical stuff is always interesting when you know what happens and you can't give it away because it has nothing to do with the story. So,
Yeah.
but I loved Romania. I thought it was great fun. So
It'll be
and
great.
you, Les, what are you working on?
Well, I'm doing. Barbara mentioned the two series that I'm editing. These are Poison Pen Press imprint books, and they're just wonderful. We have the Library of Congress Crime Classics series with some terrific titles coming up, including one of my very favorites, The Dead Letter by C. Lee Register, but also Jim Hanvey Detective, The Silent Bullet, an early Craig Kennedy collection, and a severely overlooked collection called Final Proof by a writer named Rodriguez Ottolenghi. And coming up sometime soon, one of Barbara's very favorite books, The Metropolitan Opera Murders by
No,
Helen
did
Trout.
we finally agree to do it?
We did. It's going to happen.
I am so excited. Helen Travel was the Wagnerian soprano forever. And somebody said the reason she was so great is she was built like a human bellows. She had this enormous chest and it narrowed down into her hips. I mean, she was like V-shaped or something, but she had phenomenal volume and range. And for reasons no one's ever been entirely clear about, she wrote one murder mystery. And it actually, it's a really decent plot, but B, if you're an opera fan, you're going to love how it comes out.
Yes. So
So
that's been great fun. Pardon?
Have you reread it or ever?
Not yet. Not yet.
Do you want my copy?
Sure.
I bought one. I'll send it to you, and then you can see why I'm so enamored of it.
Great. Actually, I think I have a copy, Barbara, but we'll talk offline about that. But so there's that. And I'm also doing, because I don't want to disappoint people, that there are not going to be a lot of footnotes. And so I'm doing the new annotated Jekyll and Hyde. And that'll come out probably the end of 21. Because it needed footnotes.
Because you're an addict. We all know this now.
Yes, because I'm an addict.
I love it. I'm reading a new Lisa Gardner book in which the woman is an alcoholic. And it's really fascinating how she has to keep going to meetings like at 1 a.m. when she gets off shift and I think Lisa does a really good job giving you a feeling for what it would be to be like an addict. So maybe I should send you that.
Thanks.
You could go through some 12-step program to get away from it.
I should mention one other book. My writing partner and I, Lisa Morton, put out a book called Weird Women that came out in August, which has gotten a lot of nice attention. It's a collection of supernatural fiction by women writers, mainly from the 19th century, and a wonderful collection of stories. And we've just started working on a second volume, cleverly titled Weird Women 2.
Brilliant. Patrick, anything else?
Not really. No, a lot of people watching, but I think no more real questions. I think you've covered everything.
Right. Laurie, did you have something else you wanted to say?
No, it's been fun.
Buy books, support your independent bookstores.
Right. Well, I want to thank you both for helping us get autographed copies here to the Poison Pen and for this wonderful project. It's been great to have been part of it from the very beginning.
Yes, we appreciate your support. We really do, Barbara.
But honestly, and Patrick and the whole staff, but I really love the idea behind these collections of stories. I think it's really inspiring and fun. And right now, I think we all need something inspiring and fun. And we'd like to think there really is a Sherlock Holmes, some sort of superhero that can come along and help us. This has been such an unsettling year in so many ways that there's a wonderful certainty, I think, about Holmes, right? That
no question about it.
I've looked very hard for books in December to recommend to people that are like that. This doesn't Doesn't seem
Well,
to be.
Well, Holmes called Watson the one fixed point in a changing age, but in fact, it's Holmes.
It's
Holmes is the one fixed point in our changing age.
That's a
And
very good
yeah,
point. And an excellent way to end this. So let me wish you both very happy holidays. Thank you so much for coming tonight. And for all of you who are watching it, we wish you the same. And Patrick, thanks for doing the tech as always.
Thank you,
So,
Patrick.
thanks
all right.
everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Have a good evening.
Good
Good
night.
night.